The date is March 24th, 1945. Along the Rhine River in Germany, the Ninth Army begins its crossing into the heart of Nazi territory. The Germans expect them, weapons aimed, waiting. But something strange happens. The enemy fires at shadows 10 miles south. Their intelligence reports show two entire American divisions massing at a completely different location. Thousands of German soldiers rush to defend against an army that doesn't exist. Meanwhile, the real Ninth Army crosses almost unopposed. By the time the Germans realize their mistake, thousands of American lives have been saved. This wasn't luck. This was the Ghost Army. 1,100 American soldiers who fought the Germans not with bullets, but with rubber tanks, sound effects, and the greatest act of theatrical deception in military history. And for 50 years, nobody knew they existed. Before we dive into this incredible story, make sure to hit that like button, drop a comment below, and subscribe to the channel. This is a story that deserves to be told, and I need your support to keep bringing you these hidden chapters of history. On January 20th, 1904, a classified military unit activated at Camp Forest, Tennessee, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. On paper, just another Army unit in a war filled with millions of soldiers. But this unit was different, radically different. The Pentagon had given birth to something that had never existed before in American military history. A mobile, multimedia tactical deception unit designed for one purpose: make the Germans believe American forces were somewhere they weren't. The idea came from two men with completely different backgrounds. Ralph Ingersoll, a celebrity journalist and managing editor of The New Yorker, founder of Fortune magazine, and creator of the New York newspaper PM, a man of wild ideas and creative thinking. And Colonel Billy Harris, a West Point graduate and military planner, a man who understood how to make impossible ideas work on the battlefield. Together, while working with British planners in London in late 1943, they witnessed something remarkable. The British had been using deception tactics in North Africa during Operation Bertram before the Battle of El Alamein in 1942. They'd fooled German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel about the timing and location of Allied attacks. Ingersoll and Harris saw the potential. If deception worked in the desert against one of Germany's finest commanders, it could work across Europe. But the Americans needed something bigger, something mobile, something that could move with the front lines and create illusions anywhere, anytime. They pitched the idea to top brass. Create a unit that could simulate two entire divisions, around 30,000 men. An army that could appear and disappear like ghosts. The Pentagon approved it. But who do you recruit for a mission like this? The answer was unconventional. The Army sent recruiters to art schools in New York and Philadelphia. They wanted painters, sculptors, set designers, architects, advertising men, sound engineers, radio technicians, men who understood illusion, men who could think creatively, men who could lie convincingly. Among those recruited was a young fashion student from Fort Wayne, Indiana, named Bill Blass. He would later become one of America's most famous fashion designers. But in 1943, he was just a kid with an eye for detail and design. He'd end up painting camouflage patterns and helping build fake tanks in the forests of France. Another recruit was Ellsworth Kelly, who'd requested assignment to the 603rd Camouflage Engineers. Kelly would become one of the most important minimalist painters in American art. His time with the Ghost Army essentially became his art training. There was Art Kane, who'd become famous for his iconic photography, including the legendary 1958 A Great Day in Harlem photograph. Wildlife artist Arthur Singer joined up. He'd later create the famous Birds of North America field guide illustrations and design one of the best-selling special issue postage stamp series in American history. These men weren't soldiers in the traditional sense. Many had never held a rifle before, but they had something the Army needed desperately: imagination. The unit eventually numbered 100 men, 82 officers and 1,023 enlisted. And according to reports, they had one of the highest collective IQs in the entire Army, an average of 119. They weren't just smart, they were creative problem solvers, the kind of men who could look at a problem and find solutions nobody else would think of. The Ghost Army was actually 4 separate units working together. The 603rd Camouflage Engineers, 379 men strong, handled visual deception. These were the artists. They'd create dummy airfields, fake motor pools, phony artillery batteries, even false headquarters. The 3102nd Signal Service Company Special handled sonic deception. 168 men who carried massive speakers and played recorded sounds of tanks, troops, and construction. The Signal Company Special handled radio deception, around 300 men who created fake radio traffic. They could perfectly imitate the unique Morse code patterns of real operators, something considered virtually impossible, and the 406th Combat Engineers, 168 men who provided security. Because here's the terrifying reality. These men were going to operate within yards of German positions with nothing heavier than 50 caliber machine guns. If the Germans discovered what they were doing and attacked, they'd be slaughtered. The unit trained through early 1904. At Fort Knox, Kentucky, the sonic team spent a week recording sounds. Trucks grinding gears, tanks moving back and forth across hills, half-tracks shifting through mud, soldiers shouting orders, construction equipment. Every sound a real military unit would make. These recordings were made on wire recorders, the predecessor to magnetic tape. The technology was cutting edge for 1944. The visual deception team learned to inflate rubber tanks. The U.S. Rubber Company in Woonsocket, Rhode Island, manufactured these incredible props. Each inflatable tank weighed 93 pounds and could be set up by 4 men in about 15 minutes using gasoline-powered air compressors. From a quarter-mile away, they looked completely real. The artists would then camouflage them, but here's the trick. They couldn't camouflage them too perfectly. If the camouflage was flawless, German aerial reconnaissance might get suspicious. So, they'd deliberately leave parts visible, make it look like soldiers had done a decent but imperfect job hiding their equipment, the kind of mistakes real tired soldiers would make. By May 1904, the Ghost Army shipped out to England. They based themselves near Stratford-upon-Avon, Shakespeare's birthplace. How fitting. They were about to put on the performance of their lives, and the audience would be the German army. They participated in Operation Fortitude, the massive British-led deception plan before D-Day. The Allies wanted Hitler to believe the invasion would hit Pas-de-Calais, not Normandy. Fake divisions were created. Dummy landing craft filled British harbors. Radio traffic suggested George Patton commanded a Phantom 1st U.S. Army group in southeast England. Patton, the general the Germans feared most. His presence gave the deception credibility. D-Day came on June 6, 1944. The largest amphibious invasion in history. 4 members of the Ghost Army landed with the initial waves. 8 days later, on June 14th, a 17-man platoon from the Ghost Army landed on Omaha Beach. Their first mission: create dummy artillery at night near the Normandy beaches. They used lights and visual effects to simulate additional mulberry harbors, the artificial ports the Allies were constructing. The goal was to draw German artillery fire away from the real harbors. It worked. The Germans shelled the fake positions, while the real mulberry harbors operated with less interference. But this was just the beginning. The Ghost Army's real test came in August 1904 at Brest. Operation Brest marked the first time the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops used visual, radio, and sonic deception all together. The port city of Brest in Brittany had been under siege by American forces. General Hermann Bernhard Ramke, a tough German paratroop commander who had fought under Rommel in North Africa, commanded 40,000 German troops determined to fight to the last bullet. Hitler had declared Brest a fortress. It would not be surrendered. 3 American divisions, the 2nd, 8th, and 29th Infantry, surrounded the city. Generals Omar Bradley and George Patton needed Brest as a supply port, but they also needed to convince Ramke his situation was hopeless, make him believe American forces were even larger than they actually were. The Ghost Army arrived in pouring rain on August 21, 1944. Sergeant Bob Tompkins of the 603rd Camouflage Engineers drove 158 miles in a Jeep completely exposed to the elements. In his diary, he wrote, "Oh, Adolf, you son of a bitch, I feel like a frozen, drowned rat." The mission was to impersonate 2 tank battalions from the 6th Armored Division, plus a field artillery battalion. In reality, the 6th Armored had withdrawn 2 weeks earlier. Now, the Ghost Army had to make the Germans think they were still there, and not just present. Preparing to attack. They created 3 notional task forces, Task Force X, Y, and Z. They set up inflatable tanks. The Sonic crews positioned their half-tracks, vehicles with wheels in front and tank tracks in the rear, equipped with 500-pound speakers. At night, within 500 yards of German positions, they played the sounds of tanks approaching, harboring, and withdrawing. American engineering units more than a mile away were convinced real tanks were assembling. One officer reported the sounds were so realistic, so convincing, that his own men believed a massive armored force was gathering. The Germans fell for it completely. Intelligence reports showed they shifted between 20 and 50 anti-tank guns to meet what they believed was a major armored threat. The 88mm anti-tank gun was one of Germany's most feared weapons, capable of destroying any Allied tank. The Germans moved dozens of them based on the Ghost Army's deception. But then something terrible happened. Through miscommunication, Company D of the 709th Tank Battalion, a real unit, attacked from exactly where the Ghost Army had focused German attention. The Germans opened fire instantly. 5 tanks were destroyed before they even reached the line of departure. The men were decimated. The incident haunted the Ghost Army. Lieutenant Colonel Clifford Simonson, the unit's operations officer, wrote that the tanks should not have attacked in that place, or otherwise the 23rd should have employed deception in another area. The coordination between deception and real combat operations had to be perfect. Lives depended on it. Despite this tragedy, Operation Brest taught the Ghost Army crucial lessons. Colonel Cyrus Searcy, the 8th Corps Chief of Staff, reported the visual effects were thorough and complete. The sonic deception was remarkably effective. But Brest didn't fall quickly. Ramke had more troops than American intelligence estimated, 38,000 instead of 21,000, and he refused to surrender under any circumstances. The city held for 27 more days after the main American assault began on August 25th. Ramke didn't surrender until September 19th. By that time, Paris had already been liberated, but the Ghost Army had proven they could operate in the middle of a major battle. Corporal Jack Macy from Brooklyn recalled Brest as the biggest piece of action I ever saw in World War II. They'd faced German fire, they'd learned their craft under the worst conditions, and they'd survived. September brought one of their most dangerous missions, Operation Bedembourg. General George Patton's Third Army was racing across France, smashing German forces. But in mid-September, Patton faced a problem. He was attacking the fortress city of Metz with everything he had. This left a massive gap in his line, a 70-mile stretch along the Moselle River, protected by almost nobody. Just one squadron from the 3rd Cavalry, about 760 men holding 25 miles of front line. If the Germans discovered this weakness and attacked, they could cut through and hit Patton's forces from behind. It would be a disaster. On September 14, 1944, Colonel Harry Reeder, commander of the Ghost Army, received urgent orders. Get to the front immediately. Make the Germans think the 6th Armored Division, roughly 20,000 men, was holding that position. By 4 p.m., about 400 men from the Ghost Army were on the road, heading 200 miles to Luxembourg. They drove through the night. On September 15th, they crossed into Luxembourg. The country had been liberated just 5 days earlier. Crowds lined the streets of Esch-sur-Alzette, cheering what they thought was a powerful American armored unit heading to fight the Germans. They had no idea that hidden in those canvas-covered trucks were inflatable tanks and rubber artillery pieces. The Ghost Army set up in wooded areas near Bedembourg. They created 3 fake task forces. They put out inflatable tanks and artillery. At night, the sonic crews played recorded sounds of armored vehicles. The radio operators transmitted fake traffic, coordinating with real units to create a believable picture. And the men of the Ghost Army put on shoulder patches and insignia of the 6th Armored Division. They went into nearby cafes and bars. They talked loudly about their unit. They let slip information about their supposed strength and positions. All of it calculated, all of it scripted, all of it lies designed to reach German ears. But then something almost exposed them. A French civilian in a horse-drawn buggy rode past as 4 soldiers were carrying an inflatable dummy tank, in broad daylight, right there on the road. The civilian saw them. The Ghost Army panicked. What if he was a German collaborator? What if he reported what he saw? They quickly took down the inflatable dummies, afraid German infiltrators might spot them. Operation Bedembourg was supposed to last 2 days, just until the 83rd Infantry Division could arrive to fill the gap. But the 83rd was delayed. 2 days became 3, then 4, then 8. For 8 agonizing days, roughly 400 men of the Ghost Army pretended to be 8,000 heavily armed troops. 8 days where discovery meant death. Lieutenant Bob Conrad later said there was nothing between them and the Germans, but our hopes and prayers. If the Germans had attacked, the Ghost Army had no heavy weapons to fight back. They'd have been overrun in minutes. Patton himself knew how precarious the situation was. He wrote to his wife, "There is one rather bad spot in my line, but I don't think the Huns know it, hiding it now by the grace of God and a lot of guts." The Germans never attacked. They believed the fake 6th Armored Division was there. German after-action reports mentioned that American forces in that sector kicked up such a fuss that German intelligence reported everything from an armored combat command to several divisions in a 23-mile front zone. The official 3rd Cavalry after-action report gave credit where it was due, noting the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops establishment of a simulated armored division added to the bewilderment of the enemy as to our strength. By September went, the 83rd Infantry Division finally arrived. The Ghost Army packed up their rubber tanks and sound trucks and disappeared. Lieutenant Colonel Simonson considered Operation Bedenborg a turning point. It was our first operation that was executed fully professionally and correctly. Through fall 1904, the Ghost Army continued operations across France, Luxembourg, Belgium, and Germany. They moved with the front lines, setting up deceptions, then packing up and moving to the next location, a traveling roadshow of military theater. In October, they participated in operations in the Hurtgen Forest, one of the bloodiest and most brutal battles American forces fought. In December, during the Battle of the Bulge, when German forces launched a massive surprise counterattack through the Ardennes, the Ghost Army conducted Operation Kodak. This was a radio-only deception designed to draw German attention away from the effort to relieve the surrounded American forces at Bastogne. But their greatest triumph was still to come. March 1945. The Western Allies stood on the west bank of the Rhine River, the last major natural barrier before the heart of Germany. Crossing the Rhine would be extraordinarily dangerous. The Germans expected it. They'd fortified the eastern bank. They had artillery positioned. They were ready. The 9th Army, under Lieutenant General William Simpson, planned to cross on March 23rd near a town called Wiesel. But if the Germans knew exactly where the crossing would happen, American casualties would be catastrophic. Enter Operation Viersen, the Ghost Army's final and greatest performance. The mission was simple in concept, impossible in execution. Make the Germans believe the 9th Army would cross 10 miles south of the actual location. Make them shift their forces. Draw them away from where the real attack would come. The Ghost Army had to impersonate 2 entire divisions, the 30th and 79th Infantry Divisions, around 40,000 men, more than 36 times their actual size. Lieutenant Colonel Merrick Truly, the 23rd's liaison officer attached to 9th Army headquarters, coordinated the entire operation. This wasn't just the Ghost Army working alone. This was a massive coordinated deception involving practically all of 9th Army. Everyone had to play their part perfectly. Starting March 18, 1945, the Ghost Army moved into position. They inflated more than 600 dummy vehicles, tanks, artillery pieces, jeeps, trucks. They even created fake liaison planes, L-5 observation aircraft made of inflatable rubber. The aerial photographs of these installations looked remarkably authentic. The sonic crews operated multiple nights. They played sounds of construction, pontoon bridges being assembled, artillery fire, officers shouting orders, all the sounds of an army preparing to cross a major river. The radio operators created multiple fake headquarters. They transmitted constantly, coordinating between units that didn't exist. Men from the Ghost Army, dressed in officers' uniforms, pretending to be colonels and generals. They set up fake command posts. They staffed them with these impersonators. They made sure German spies and reconnaissance could see American military police at checkpoints. Vehicle convoys with the markings of the 30th and 79th Divisions moved through the area. Everything was designed to create a complete picture, an entire army massing for a major operation. Real bridging units were even attached to the 23rd. They assembled some actual bridge sections near the fake crossing point, added authenticity, made the whole picture more believable. At night, the Ghost Army used flash canisters to simulate artillery fire, bright flashes in the darkness that looked exactly like real guns firing. The Germans responded. They pounded the Ghost Army positions with heavy artillery, but the only things getting destroyed were inflatable tanks and rubber artillery pieces. And every time a dummy got punctured, soldiers rushed out to patch it before daybreak. They couldn't let German aerial reconnaissance spot damaged inflatables in the morning light. The deception worked beyond anyone's expectations. German intelligence reported major American forces massing in exactly the locations the Ghost Army had created. German units moved to positions across the river from the fake army. When the real 30th and 79th Infantry Divisions attacked miles north, they met only disorganized resistance. The crossing succeeded with astonishingly low casualties. The 30th Division's intelligence officer reported the U.S. attack came as a complete surprise to the enemy with a consequent saving of American lives. Captured German maps showed the 79th Division in exactly the location the Ghost Army had portrayed. The Germans had completely lost track of the 30th Division's real position. The 9th Army's intelligence officer stated the Germans expected the main Allied effort to be made north of Wesel with only a minor crossing opposite Krefeld. Exactly the opposite of reality. Lieutenant General Simpson himself commended the 23rd for their work. Operation Viersen may have saved thousands of lives. Some estimates say the Ghost Army's efforts throughout the war saved between 15,000 and 30,000 American soldiers. But this success came at a price. The Ghost Army wasn't invulnerable. 3 men were killed during operations. Dozens more were wounded. One of the deadliest days came during Operation Bougainville in March 1945. The Ghost Army was caught in German artillery fire. Men were wounded. Jacob Goldberg, a medic, treated wounded soldiers under fire and later received a Bronze Star for his heroism. Every operation carried risk. These men operated within yards of enemy positions. German patrols were constantly looking for weaknesses. If the enemy had discovered the truth, if a German unit had overrun one of their positions and captured their equipment, the retaliation would have been brutal. The Ghost Army's sonic half-tracks were wired with explosives. If it looked like the enemy would capture them, the men had orders to pull a lever. 15 seconds to get away before the entire vehicle detonated, destroying the secret equipment before the Germans could examine it. Think about that. These men, armed with nothing but machine guns and sidearms, stood surrounded by inflatable tanks designed to draw enemy fire. They knew if things went wrong, they had to destroy their equipment and run. They knew they were targets, but they did it anyway, night after night, operation after operation. After Operation Viersen, the Ghost Army's mission essentially ended. Germany was collapsing. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. The Ghost Army returned to the United States in July. They were deactivated on September 15, 1945, shortly after Japan surrendered. And then something remarkable happened. They disappeared completely. The men of the Ghost Army were sworn to secrecy. They couldn't tell their families what they'd done. They couldn't talk about it with other veterans. The military classified everything. All the records, all the after-action reports, all the photographs. Everything went into classified files. Why? The Cold War was starting. The Pentagon thought they might need to use similar deception tactics against the Soviet Union. They couldn't let the world know exactly how American military deception worked. So, these 100 men went home and said nothing. Bill Blass became one of America's most famous fashion designers. He never talked about the Ghost Army. Ellsworth Kelly became one of the most important painters of the 20th century. He rarely discussed his service. Art Kane created some of the most iconic photographs in American history. He kept his Ghost Army service quiet. For 50 years, one of the most remarkable stories of World War II remained classified. Veterans of the Ghost Army took their secrets to their graves. Families didn't know what their fathers and grandfathers had really done during the war. Some veterans told vague stories about being in a transportation unit or working on equipment, but they couldn't reveal the truth. Kim Seal's father, Oscar Seal, was a captain in the Ghost Army. Kim knew his father had served in the war. Oscar mentioned he'd transitioned from a tank division to serving as a courier, but that was all he'd say. Oscar died in 2001 at age 84. About 6 months later, Kim got a call from someone organizing a Ghost Army reunion. Kim was confused. "What do you mean, Ghost Army?" He had no idea. His father had kept his oath of secrecy until death. In '96, the US military finally declassified the Ghost Army records. Suddenly, these elderly men in their 70s and 80s could finally talk about what they'd done more than 50 years earlier. Families learned the truth. Historians began investigating. Rick Beyer, a filmmaker and author, became fascinated with the story. He spent years tracking down surviving veterans, interviewing them, collecting their artwork and photographs. In 2013, PBS aired his documentary, The Ghost Army. The secret was finally out, but recognition took even longer. For years, families of Ghost Army veterans lobbied Congress. They wanted these men honored for their service. Finally, on February 1st, 2022, President Joe Biden signed the Ghost Army Congressional Gold Medal Act into law. The Congressional Gold Medal is one of the highest civilian honors Congress can bestow. It's been awarded only about 170 times in American history. On March 21st, 2024, a ceremony was held at the U.S. Capitol. 3 surviving Ghost Army veterans attended: Seymour Nussenbaum, 100 years old; Bernard Bluestein, also 100; and John Chrisman, 99, 3 of fewer than 10 known surviving members of the unit. Seymour Nussenbaum had been studying art at the Pratt Institute in New York when he was drafted in 1943. "Our mission was to fool the enemy, to put on a big act," he said at the ceremony. Bernie Bluestein was 19 when he saw a vaguely worded notice at his Cleveland Art College in March 1943. The Army was seeking recruits for a non-combat camouflage unit. He enlisted. "If I had known that before I got into the service, I probably would have made a different decision," he said later, laughing. He hadn't known he'd be operating within yards of German positions. John Chrisman remembered the danger, the constant fear that the Germans would discover what they were doing. At the ceremony, House Speaker Mike Johnson said the Ghost Army's work saved an estimated 15,000 to 30,000 American lives. Secretary of the Army Christine Wormuth noted that traces of the Ghost Army's approach can still be found in modern military operations. Even though technology has changed quite a bit since 1904, our modern techniques build on a lot of what the Ghost Army did, and we are still learning from your legacy. The Ghost Army's equipment and techniques influenced modern military doctrine, the concept of multimedia tactical deception, the understanding that you can manipulate enemy behavior through carefully coordinated illusions. These ideas are still studied and applied today. An Army analyst who studied their missions 30 years after the war wrote, "Rarely, if ever, has there been a group of such a few men which had so great an influence on the outcome of a major military campaign." Think about what these 1 in 100 men accomplished. They didn't kill thousands of enemy soldiers. They didn't capture strategic objectives. They didn't storm beaches or hold defensive positions. Instead, they saved American lives by making the Germans waste resources, move troops to wrong locations, and prepare for attacks that never came. They won battles before the battles even started, and they did it with art, creativity, and sheer audacity. The Ghost Army represents something unique in military history. A unit where artists became warriors, where creativity became a weapon, and where the pen, or rather the paintbrush and sound recording, proved mightier than the sword. These men weren't traditional heroes. They didn't fit the Hollywood image of what a soldier should be, but they were brave. Operating within yards of enemy positions with nothing but inflatable rubber and recorded sounds between them and German artillery. They were clever, finding creative solutions to impossible problems, making 100 men look like 30,000, and they were dedicated, carrying their secret for 50 years because their country asked them to. Bill Blass, who became a fashion icon, later reflected on his service. He sketched his corporate logo while lying on a bunk in Luxembourg in 1904. Fashion and war might seem worlds apart, but for Blass, the attention to detail, the understanding of how appearance creates perception, these skills translated directly from the battlefield to the runway. Ellsworth Kelly's time with the Ghost Army essentially became his art education, learning to create visual illusions, to understand how color and form could deceive the eye from a distance. These lessons informed his later minimalist paintings that would hang in major museums around the world. Today, you can visit museums and see exhibitions about the Ghost Army. Original inflatable tanks are on display at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. Artwork created by Ghost Army soldiers during the war hangs in galleries. Their story has been told in books, documentaries, and now, hopefully, in videos like this one. But perhaps the most fitting memorial is simply remembering what they accomplished. 100 men, more than 20 major deception operations, battles from Normandy to the Rhine, and an estimated 15,000 to 30,000 American lives saved, not through violence, but through imagination. They proved that in war, as in art, sometimes the most powerful weapon is the one nobody sees coming. The Ghost Army fooled the Nazis over and over again, and for 50 years, they fooled the rest of the world too, by staying completely silent, by keeping their incredible story secret, by being ghosts in every sense of the word. Now their story is finally known, and it deserves to be remembered. These men, these artists and engineers and radio operators, these creative souls who found themselves in the middle of the most brutal war in human history, they changed warfare forever. They showed that there's more than one way to fight, more than one way to win. Sometimes, the greatest victory comes not from destroying your enemy, but from making your enemy destroy themselves by chasing shadows. That's the story of the Ghost Army. 1,100 artists who created the greatest deception in military history. The men who fought World War II with rubber tanks, sound effects, and pure imagination, and won.